Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Hail Caesar. When Hollywood makes a movie about itself, it almost has to do it in a big Hollywood way. It's almost like Hollywood fantasy can't be done without being made in a very Hollywood fantasy way. It's like they can't accept it because that's how it's been presented to them originally. And the Coen brothers kind of continue that tradition with Hail Caesar, but of course they do it in the fantasy of what they want Hollywood to be, of the classic studio system, or at least how it was in the 50s. You can tell they're having fun with that fantasy. They're using it as fantasy and doing a big Hollywood movie about Hollywood in the way that Hollywood likes to do it. None of these people, except for Josh Brolin as Eddie Mannix, are really playing real stars. They're playing made-up stars so they can play with the ideas of them. Certainly, some of the actors are playing people who are types, like Scarlett Johansson's playing an Esther Williams type, Channing Tatum's kind of playing a Gene Kelly type, George Clooney's kind of playing almost a Charlton Heston type, sort of, maybe. Eddie Mannix, the classic Hollywood fixer, and putting him on this adventure with Hollywood stars that they can mess around with. What the Coen brothers usually do with the period pieces, have a lot of fun with it, but I feel like in this one they have more fun than they've had with Inside Llewyn Davis or True Grit. It's them really playing with the classic Hollywood studio system and really showing their love for it. This is a movie about classic Hollywood made by classic Hollywood film dorks. Kenneth Turan of the Los Angeles Times say that this was a hipster view of classic Hollywood, and it kind of is. It just takes out all the little interesting things they like about classic Hollywood and make, their own made-up studio, which is the same name as the studio from Barton Fink, and play around with it. It's kind of like a postmodern idea of classic Hollywood, but that's the fun of it. You get to watch the Coen brothers play in that classic Hollywood studio system and kind of make it their own, using ideas, even the whole idea of blacklisted writers and communism and fixers and scandals that you didn't really know about that the studio was covering up. It's all within that guise, but almost within that guise and within a very kind of almost traditional Coen brothers kind of plot, but mixed together in their usual odd structure, making kind of one of their more funnier, looser comedies where you can tell they almost care more about the setting than the actual plot, but it all ends up as kind of a very funny, enjoyable, classic Hollywood fun experience with a Coen twist. Eddie Mannix, who is the classic Hollywood fixer, played by Josh Brolin, who is just trying to fix any scandal that could ruin the studio and make it lose its money. And then the biggest actor on their biggest production, Hail Caesar, is their big prestige picture and their big blockbuster that year. Its lead, Brad Whitlock, who's played by George Clooney, is abducted, and he gets a message that's from a cult group, or he believes it to be a cult group, that he needs to bring $100,000 and they will return Brad Whitlock so they can finish their massive big picture. And unfortunately they can't shoot around him because he's about to shoot the big emotional payoff scene for the entire movie. So Eddie Mannix has to find a way to get Brad Whitlock back while also taking care of scandals such as Scarlett Johansson's character coming pregnant out of wedlock, and a bad casting of a former Western star going into a melodrama, and trying to get all those things fixed so he can keep the studio running. When I was watching this movie, I was thinking about, there's this one scene where you see Channing Tatum do this amazing tap dance sequence, and Josh Brolin's character of Eddie Mannix comes to the set and he's watching them film, and you see this whole elaborate sequence that they filmed for the movie, that it's supposed to look like they're filming this sequence in the movie and we're watching it and we're there at the same time that this is all being filmed. But in it, we only see one camera, yet there's still multiple cuts. And I've noticed that in other films about Hollywood is suddenly they'll be filming a scene, and like if you look at the equipment there, it's like clearly they put on the show of the movie that was completely inaccurate to how they actually film movies. It's like the opening of Roger Rabbit, and then suddenly it's just like one camera. And I mean, I know Roger Rabbit's a cartoon, but under the guise of Roger Rabbit, this movie shares similarities to Roger Rabbit, but the idea of that whole opening sequence in Roger Rabbit is the idea that they filmed it, and then when you cut away, you're like, wait, there's one camera, and like, how are all these cuts and everything? It wasn't like they had multiple cameras and anything like that. To do some of those shots, they'd have to do a whole new setup and break for lunch and move the lighting and everything like that, and that's obviously not as much fun to show. And it's kind of the whole idea of this movie is that it is still very much a Hollywood movie, but it's capturing Hollywood, and that's an odd idea that Hollywood movies always have, and Hail Caesar very much does. But it's like they're all self-aware about it, but it almost feels like Hail Caesar is extra self-aware about what it's doing and extra self-aware about what it's saying about these certain types of movie stars and that type of studio. And I always find that interesting. It's like Hollywood can't let you fully in. They like want you to believe the fantasy of it. And it's like someone like the Coen brothers did it in the most Hollywood way, but it's like kind of interesting because there's certain sequences in this movie that if you've seen the advertising in the trailer, you probably thought were something someone was filming on a set during the movie, and it isn't. That's the whole kind of interesting idea of it. They're playing in this Hollywood world, but they can't not show it as a Hollywood movie. And that's interesting, especially for someone like the Coen brothers who started out as independent filmmakers and very much not a part of the studio system. It's kind of like the most celebrating of studios and very Hollywood movies, but it's actually very good at it. I don't think I've seen a film that's about Hollywood and classic Hollywood that's been this good in a long time. Usually we get crap like Hitchcock or something, not the director of the actual movie. And also that they're not actually using real movie stars. They mention Cary Grant, they mention certain characters, but they kind of play more with the kind of archetypes that we know from that era. And much like Roger Rabbit, how Roger Rabbit wasn't a cartoon character that ever existed. He's kind of like a Tex Avery cartoon character. He never existed, so they can kind of play around and do different things. Be different if Mickey Mouse was the star of Roger Rabbit. And same with this, it'd be weird if Clooney was playing Charlton Heston. So they can bring up the religious epics, and clearly Hail Caesar is kind of more of a Ben-Hur type situation. It feels like it's kind of supposed to be Ben-Hur, or the idea of those big religious epics that were so popular in that era. And same with like the Scarlett Johansson, Esther Williams type thing. I don't remember very many movies like that about a mermaid. They get to play around and make their own kind of twists on these Hollywood films. Certainly I'd love for someone to come on and play like William Wellman and have Buster Keaton walk by and have all this crazy stuff going on, but it's almost more fun the way they do it. I kind of like that about Hollywood movies about Hollywood. It goes all the way back to the silent era with, I think, Show People, I believe. There's a great tradition of that, but the Coen brothers, it almost feels like directors more at play in a way that I like about their comedies. I am not a big Coen brother comedy fan. I'm a fan, obviously, of like The Big Lebowski, as is everyone, and Raising Arizona, and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? But everyone they've made since Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? They're all kind of funny movies, but all the ones that are just comedies like Lady Killers and Intolerable Cruelty and Burn After Reading, I think have been all their probably weaker efforts. In fact, probably one of the reasons that No Country for Old Men was so celebrated was because everyone was afraid that the Coen brothers were over after watching The Lady Killers and Intolerable Cruelty. This has more of a fun energy to it that those films didn't really have. The Coen brothers structure is odd and it's stranger, and sometimes it does feel like they're falling apart in too long. This to me didn't feel too long, but I also think the thing with this movie is that this movie hits my certain demographic pretty hard. I'm someone who likes classic Hollywood. I like the Coen brothers. They're back with Roger Deakins. And I noticed most of the audience in the theater was not as into this film as much as I was. And I can't really speak on what it's like to watch a film about classic Hollywood. I don't know everything. I don't think I'm an expert. It's a subject I'm quite interested in. Most of the people maybe seeing this aren't as familiar with classic Hollywood. They might just know Wizard of Oz and a few others. They don't really love it that much. From my perspective, I really liked it. I think it was probably their best comedy since Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It will be interesting to hear from people who aren't like super movie dorks what they think of this. I don't know if it really is for them anyway, so maybe they were never going to like it to begin with, but I still think it's a very fun movie. I do actually like the Coen brothers now. They've gotten a lot more Hollywood with things like True Grit and even writing the screenplay to a Steven Spielberg movie. They're impeccably good at it. And then they can still leave and do something like Inside Llewyn Davis, which doesn't feel very Hollywood at all. They understand the fine craftsmanship to it, the economics of making a Hollywood movie, and in this they kind of get a little weird, but not too weird. I did like that this film was actually shot on film. They felt that they couldn't really capture classic Hollywood on digital, even though Roger Deakins has been using digital cameras more often, particularly when he shot the Bond movie and I believe Sicario as well. You do get some like classic Roger Deakins shots in certain places, particularly there's like a night driving sequence towards the end of the film. I know, big spoilers, but most of it is kind of shot more traditionally like classic Hollywood stuff usually is, so it almost like doesn't feel as Deakins, but it's interesting to see him shoot all these mini movies in it. I've heard this referred to as almost an anthology film because they get to shoot all these different kinds of movies throughout this movie. There's a lot of movies within movies in this movie. I did quite like Josh Brolin as Eddie Mannix. Is probably the least showiest of all the roles. In fact, I think the people who are maybe a little more subtle are probably the better performances in this film, but I've never seen an interview with Eddie Mannix, but he just played that role to perfection, and he's a really good lead, bringing it all together and almost almost like gets the whole Coen Brothers protagonist. Obviously he's done that before in No Country for Old Men, but there's something about him that just plays off the weary existential decision making that goes throughout a Coen Brothers film that just plays very well on his face. The other person who is probably the least famous person is Alden Ehrenreich, I think his name will be right over here. He plays Hobble Doyle, who's this Western star who's trying to be in a romantic comedy, and he has a lot of funny scenes. He's actually very good in this movie. I wasn't really that familiar with him before seeing this film, but I quite liked him in this. Clooney, I think, does a good job. He's very good at playing a classic movie star. He's probably the most perfect casting because everyone's always saying how Clooney is like a classic movie star. So in this, he actually gets to play one. And I like almost cameos from some of these people, like Frances McDormand and Jonah Hill, and Scarlett Johansson's kind of funny. I like Ralph Fiennes, and Channing Tatum was amazing in his sequences. He really pulls off the classic movie star charm. Everyone in this is kind of like the modern movie stars now who can do the classic movie star thing to perfection. I mean, the only one I can think of that wasn't in this was like Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And Tilda Swinton was amazing. I mean, there's probably people I'm forgetting, but there's just so many good people in this movie. I mean, they had a pretty amazing cast, and it's kind of one of those times where like Scorsese's done it as well, where they know they're a powerful director and they know they have a name, so they get as many stars as they can possibly get. I guess Woody Allen does that also. They almost seem to have more fun with it. Like, you were on the lot and you'd see all these stars, and obviously if you're Eddie Mannix, you'd have to deal with all these problems every day and deal with 4 or 5 stars and different personalities. If you're going to have a lot of cameos in your movie, I think the Coens found a way for it to work, and if it's going to be gimmicky, it works for a film like this. I thought that added to the fun. Hail Caesar shows the fun of making a movie about Hollywood and the fun of the fantasy of it, and it plays up the fantasy and the falsity kind of making a Hollywood movie about Hollywood, calling to mind how most of these big Hollywood movies, especially in the studio era, were definitely made as fantasies. And it's almost like they're making a fantasy about a fantasy factory in a way. And a lot of times when they do that, it just comes off as fake. The way they have fun with it, the way they both use the comedy and the setting, and in some places I think almost fall in love with the setting as much as the actual mystery of all that. And maybe it's the more fun film in their filmography you have a good time with. You probably watch more than you maybe should, especially if you're into classic Hollywood. It's not an amazing comedy. It's not going to be one of the best comedies I've seen all year, hopefully, but it was still a really enjoyable, fun, classic Hollywood kind of comedy, and I found that to be a really good time at the movies. So if you have seen Hail Caesar and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.